Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. I'm so thrilled today to be joined by the fantastic Andrew Horton, currently starring in the Netflix series Jupiter's Legacy. And the first thing I wanted to ask you about was the audition process, and when you first kind of got those initial sides for your character, how you started to, even at that stage of the journey, start thinking about how you wanted to develop him and how you really saw this character coming for life, even though you were just coming in for the audition at that point.
So when I auditioned, I was in Vietnam on holiday with my girlfriend and just shot a self-tape. I think by that point, they had been casting the role of Brandon for quite a long time and hadn't managed to find the right person. And I read through the pilot script, which was very, very similar to what's actually in the finished series. And I was like, wow, this is really cool. And I've seen Mark's work before. I'm familiar with it. So to know that, he was spearheading the project was really exciting as well. And to see some of the exec names attached to it. It's like, okay, so they're taking this seriously. This is going to be a big project. I never thought in a million years that it would go beyond just the initial audition and then getting the part, because it all turned around in a week, I think. I auditioned, came back to the UK, had a Skype with Stephen DeKnight, who was our first showrunner. About halfway through that week, I waited for 2 days, absolutely biting my nails down to the core and sweating and sleepless nights. And then the following Friday, I found out that I got the part, and I was completely blown away. And I was an emotional wreck, as my girlfriend will tell anyone who wants to hear the story. But as far as the character goes, I wasn't familiar with the comics before having been cast, so I immediately got everything I could and read them all through a bunch of times. And what's very interesting about the comic books, as a comparison to the series, is that we see a very different version of Brandon in both. So for me, I was preparing in my mind the kind of version of Brandon that there is in the comics. He's pretty dark. He's very disillusioned with the world that they live in, with the code, with his relationship with his father. It's all not going particularly well. And then within the series, it's the time before that. So he's still very earnest. He's still very, very much in training to take over the mantle of the Utopian, and is really into his superheroing, as I call it, and is giving it his absolute all to impress his father, and still not living up to the expectations that's put upon him. So for me, I really got to create something that was completely new and completely fresh, which was incredibly exciting. And because I wasn't able to read all of the scripts ahead of time, just because I think we were given them, I think I read maybe the first 2 or 3 before we actually started filming, and then we would get the new scripts as they were being written. So it was very much a process of read the script, break it down, create a playlist to go alongside to get me into an emotional state of mind, perhaps, and writing all over my pages in terms of my intentions for the scenes and things like that. So it was very much an organic process once I was actually out in Toronto, rather than it being a really, really researched thing that I could do beforehand, because the subject material was there for me, but because it was so different, it was all about making it my own, as I said, and that was great fun.
Yeah. And in developing out that father-son relationship, in particular with Josh Duhamel, it's great. It's really interesting to watch the trajectory of that, because there's a lot of inflections and details from Brandon's childhood, even down to the fact that, his dad would be gone at the drop of a second and spent a lot of time even not there as a parent, even though there is a lot of closeness between them, which causes a really interesting emotional juxtaposition between the two of them. And so how in depth did the two of you want to get about a lot of those childhood details and what's led the relationship up to the point where we see it on screen in the series?
I think for Josh and I, it was again very much we get to the set, we play and we explore with the scene. Josh was incredibly busy. His schedule was absolutely ridiculous. So we didn't have as much time as perhaps I would have liked to have outside of shooting to, go over things and talk to them. But that wasn't through any fault of his own. It was literally just because he'd be shooting 1920s stuff in the morning, and then we'd have a scene, a night shoot in the evening where he'd be in full grey and long wig and all of that kind of stuff. So as I say, it was very much just playing when we got there. And because Josh is an amazing actor and he's extremely generous, we would try lots of different things. And as you say, there's a really nice juxtaposition within the series of those beats. And I think it can just be with like looks and with gestures and with the cadence of his voice. Josh talked about that a lot, that it can just be inferred rather than it being, specific detail orientated work that we had done. So for me, that was a great experience as well, just to really work on my feet and feel the kind of difficulties that they would have, because I was experiencing those difficulties as an actor as well at the same time. The difficulties they were having as a father and a son, I would experience that because I'm completely new to this world and I'm feeling quite intimidated acting opposite Josh. And then you're playing out a scene where it's talking about how I can never live up to the expectations that have been laid down before me. So it's very much art imitating life to a certain extent, but as I say, Josh was great fun and was hugely supportive to me throughout the whole series, and was really, really kind with what he said to me and what he gave me to work with on screen.
As you worked on more scenes with him and Leslie Bibb, who plays your mom in the show, did you find that you started to either consciously or unconsciously absorb some of the nuanced details of what they were bringing to their characters? Because obviously, as their son, there's certain characteristics and traits that he would develop and absorb from them being his parents. And so did you find yourself as a performer doing that?
I think so, yeah. It's interesting. There's very much a stoicism to Josh and to the utopian. So Brandon takes a lot of that on as well. As a character, he takes himself very seriously, and that is very much reflected throughout the series. I feel, he's not a bundle of laughs. He's pretty complicated and emotionally downtrodden, I feel. So he carries a lot of that emotional burden with him, as Josh carries the emotional burden of the world's expectations upon his shoulders. So there was a nice knock-on effect, a domino effect there. And then with Leslie, she's very much a person for improvising and changing the script and working around it while still keeping the core of the scene, and I absolutely love that. It's not something that I have loads of experience with, but it was definitely something that was lovely to play with in our scenes together. One of which was sadly cut short in the final edit, but that's the nature of the cutting room floor. Some scenes that you desperately want to be in there in their fullest forms sometimes get cut down to a few words, and that was what happened with this particular scene. But it was lovely. It was a scene which is shot just before a funeral, which takes place in episode 2 of the series. And Leslie and I were probably working on the scene for a good few hours together and just had loads of different iterations. And to feel so vulnerable in front of another actor was amazing, because at that point, Brandon is completely broken. He's so upset and doesn't know what to do, and he turns to his mother for guidance because she is the emotional branch to him, which his father isn't. So having such different styles to play off because of what they were playing was great, just because it makes the story that much more interesting.
And you mentioned, obviously there is that external weight and responsibility of what it means to be part of this literal legacy throughout the show. And he's grown up with that expectation on his shoulders. And then at the same time, the setting of where they live is really fascinating, because they live very much out in the middle of nowhere. You can't see another house as far as the eye can go. And it's actually very isolated. So they live in a real bubble of isolation and a very small community. But at the same time, there's a huge, kind of like worldwide eye on them at the same time. And so how did you take both of those two really opposing details and think about the way that would have impacted him as a character?
I think the isolation aspect definitely impacts Brandon, because he spends so much time in training to become the utopian that he misses out on a lot of social aspects. I was talking about this in press week with Elena, in that Chloe's character, in a sense, is far more life experience than Brandon is, because she's doing all of these different things. They're not the things for him, they're not the things for everyone. And they're things which both, Sheldon and Grace are disapproving of and or worried about. And Brandon kind of takes on some of that parenting role, in a sense, but he's also more childlike than she is, because he's only ever experienced the bubble and he doesn't want to break outside of it. That's what he wants to carry on living in, and he's happy with that, whereas Chloe is very much anti-establishment and doesn't want anything to do with that, which I thought was really interesting and creates for a lovely dynamic between Brandon and Chloe within the series. And then I think, in terms of like the wider eye looking in, it just adds that much more pressure on him again, because not only is he isolated in this lovely farmhouse which we shot in, which actually was completely in the middle of nowhere and you couldn't see another house for a good mile in either direction. Not only does being in that space isolate him, but the fact that he doesn't have anyone around him that's his age. He doesn't live in the city as Chloe does, and he will bow out of social events and things like that because he's more interested in training than maintaining his relationships, which, as we learn, have taken something of a backseat to that. And I think his mum doesn't think it's a good thing. I think Uncle Walter, played by the magnificent Ben Daniels, doesn't think it's a good thing either. And, you'd think that the utopian would think it was a good thing, but even he is still dismissive of his son and quite disparaging, even though he's got super hearing, so can hear everything he's saying on the roof, which isn't very tactful at all.
And with Elena and playing your sister, that dynamic is really well fleshed out, and for so many of the details that you were just mentioning as part of it, were the two of you consciously thinking about how you really wanted to create these opposing siblings that come from the same family and the same experience, but that expectation of legacy and the constant criticism on them as well, and the different ways that it kind of pushes them in completely opposite directions? Was that a conscious thing that you were both thinking about, or did that just naturally come together because of so many of the details being in the writing already?
I think it's a mix of both, really. Elena's character is fantastic, and she's a fantastic actor, so she brought so much to act opposite, which was amazing for me. And there is so much within the text, as you say, that it makes our jobs so much easier as actors when the text is really good. But for the one specific scene, which probably I enjoyed most, acting opposite Elena, which is just after the dinner sequence in episode 1, we had a fantastic director called Mark Jobst, who's a British director and works very much, in my mind at least, kind of like a theatrical director. So really wants you to dig into the scene and asks you, well, why is Brandon doing this? Or why is Chloe doing this? And why is he saying this? What does he want from this? And before we shot the scene, we would talk through our characters' intentions, and why they're saying what they're saying and what they want from that interaction. And then once you get into playing that, and once you're just repeating the same words over and over, you can find different angles and different shades within that scene, because we were prepared, we had done our homework. Mark wanted us to really feel that relationship and understand the complexity of it, rather than just jumping straight in and being like, okay guys, let's go for a couple and see what we find. I think the fact that we came so prepared, and we did have such different characters, obviously, but the way we were playing our characters was also so different that just adds to that sense of separation between them. But the thing which binds them together is the fact that they do have like this deep love for each other, and they do really care for each other, which makes it all the more heartbreaking, in a sense, that they are so far apart from each other emotionally and in terms of distance.
Yeah. And with the costumes in the show, the costume designer and their whole team, they've clearly thought very specifically about a lot of the minute details and how they've crafted such individualized looks that really reflect a lot about the character. And for you, I was interested in where that comes into play in terms of your character development process, because, you know, sometimes it starts as more of an external thing and finding some of the physicality of a character, and sometimes the internal then dictates that. So when and where does that come into your journey of developing a character, particularly when it's something so specific like his costumes in this?
So for me, before I started shooting, I also put on quite a lot of weight to carry around that extra size and fit that superhero aesthetic. So Stephen DeKnight asked me to put on about 30 pounds of muscle in quite a short amount of time, which was a real challenge, but something that I really enjoyed as well. So to feel myself becoming more powerful was an experience in itself, and then to put the suit on top of that, it just adds a whole another dimension. Liz Wolfe and her team did an absolutely amazing job, and as we said the whole of last week, the suits just imbue such a sense of character so effortlessly. So it's not like you have to look for a walk or discover a walk, because as soon as you're in the suit, you're walking in a certain way, and you're holding yourself in such a way that that is your character. I mean, what was so fantastic about this opportunity is the fact that it's never been done before. So these are the original versions of all of these characters. So that's the walk, or that's their physicality. So it could be whatever you wanted it to be. So certainly when you're wearing the suits, because you've got a muscle suit and then the exoskeleton over the top and the capes, it pulls your posture into this very heroic stance anyway. So you can't have anyone with, you know, slumped shoulders and a gut poking out. Not that anyone would have had a gut on the show, because we all worked so hard in the gym. Yeah, you're made to feel powerful already, and then with what everyone was bringing to their characters, each person had such an individual costume that even the colors and the armoring design on, like my suit for instance, that's very different to Josh's. So it gives the younger generation and the older generation that nice that nice divide anyway, and adds to the tension in a way, because, you know, we'd be like, oh well, our suits are cooler than yours, and, you know, all of that kind of smack talk, which was very enjoyable.
And with the training that you did, it wasn't just a case of kind of physically bulking up. A lot of it's, you know, learning a lot of the specific moves and choreography, and the fight sequences and the stunt work in the show tell such a story about each character in every single moment. You know, every single frame counts in those sequences. And so what are the ways in which the stunt team would be working specifically with you even before you went into production, and thinking about, you know, all of the moves and choreographing that they were starting to teach you and train you in terms of character and story, and how it was always there to move it forward?
So we were matched with stuntmen and stuntwomen before we even got to Toronto. So, you know, the production would have our measurements, because the stunt doubles would need to be measured up for the suits as well. So you find these people who have a similar physicality and physique to you, and then our stunt coordinator, Phil Silvera, took us through an intensive, about month-long stunt boot camp before we even started shooting. So that would involve a couple of hours, 5 days a week, where we would do movement drills, and you know, we would start to see some of the coordinated fights being practiced. You know, we practiced the hilltop sequence for at least 3 weeks, and then we shot it for about 3 weeks as well. So there was a lot of time which went into these things, and it's to make sure not only that people are safe, but also that you're really selling what it is that you're doing, and that you're putting the right amount of intensity into it. And the thing which Phil focuses on the most is that the action serves the story. It's not just an action scene for the sake of being an action scene. It needs to drive the story forward, and that's the most important thing. And I think he achieved that massively, as did, you know, the cast and our fantastic group of stunt performers. They were all absolutely amazing. So it was very intense, but I loved every second of it, and I just wanted to do more. When I had downtime, I just wanted to go and train with the stunt people.
And both at the beginning of the series and at the end of the series, there's really great sequences that both very much are about, you know, Brandon and his father and their relationship. And I imagine that must be a really fascinating challenge to approach, because the movement of those scenes is physically so large and so wide and so big. And at the same time, you have to have a real intimate connectivity and story and conversation with Josh in those scenes. So how do you work about finding your performance in a moment where it's asking two very different things from you in that way?
For me, I love movement anyway, so a lot of the emotion comes through the movement, and the preparation, you know, gets you in that headspace for those scenes. You know, with Hilltop, you've got the massive climax, which I won't spoil, but where I have to make a life or death decision, and then similarly at the end you have to make a life or death decision, but one is far more loaded than the other, or they're both loaded in very different ways rather. In the first one, it's carrying that trauma that Brandon experiences, and his grief and his rage. And then in the second one, it's more about desperation and fear, almost, but still channeling that power and that aggression and finding very different ways of expressing those. And you know, the fights are quite scrappy, they're not clean, and I like that about them, is the fact that in a life or death situation, it's not all about, you know, smooth lines and you know, perfectly choreographed kicks or punches. It's very much a struggle, and to have those little beats after the scenes as well. The one in the first instance where I'm being completely scolded and treated like a child, and then the second one where it's me helping Josh up and me being in that position of power. I loved that dynamic shift, and how they've left the series open at that ending in that way to hopefully set it up for more to come. And it gives us a really nice sense of Brandon's journey to go from the beginning, where he'll take the crap essentially from his father, and then at the end, who knows, is he done, is he not done, will he carry on in the training, will he let it go? These are all questions which we're hoping will be answered with further series. But I loved it. Yeah, really fun.
And with all the roles that you've taken on so far in your career, this, you know, I believe this was the first time that you were taking on, you know, one of the series leads throughout the entire TV show. And so how did that force you to work and think in a very different way? Because even just, you know, the psyche that you have to walk in with every day, the way that you develop a character, and you have to create so many more arcs and journeys. And also, you know, like you said, even at the end of the series, you have to leave some open threads. You can't necessarily close
it off
either. So how was that a really different way of developing and playing a character and thinking about the mentality that you needed in coming to work every day from previous projects for you?
I think more than anything, it was the longevity of the project that I wasn't used to. I think the longest I'd done on a project before was 3 months, which was on a theatre job. And by the end of that, I was wanting it to be over, just because theatre is pretty relentless. You know, you're working 7 days a week doing the same thing every single time, and whilst you can find different things throughout the run and throughout the performances, and you always want to be playing, you always want to be finding something new, sometimes that's not helpful for your other castmates, because they could be used to you playing a certain beat, and then it changes in a performance and you've thrown them off, and then the cue's gone, and then one thing leads to another, and someone's fluffed their line or something like that. But the thing I loved about the television aspect of it was the fact that we could try multiple different versions, and we could have, you know, as many takes as we wanted to, and I didn't have to worry about the fact that if I lose a line, the whole thing's gone to crap. Like it wasn't one of those things that I had to concern myself with. I think the biggest challenge for me was convincing myself that I was worthy of being in that playground, essentially, because with it being my first big credit, and with me being the least credited person in the cast, probably, that was very daunting for me. And when you're playing a superhero, you can't be apologetic about it. So it was it was giving myself some of Brandon's confidence, I suppose, but it's also what allowed me to channel that emotional vulnerability at the same time, because I was experiencing the same things. I felt a lot of pressure on my shoulders, even though it wasn't explicitly placed upon me by anyone. It was just me putting it on myself. But again, that's exactly the same scenarios with Brandon. You know, it's not necessarily that anyone else is asking this of him. He's just asking it of himself. So to learn from that, and then to just approach every day and try and really make the most of it was the most important thing for me, I think. And having the ability to prepare scenes and take the time beforehand and, you know, rehearse them and then be able to shoot them and then try all of these different renditions. It was amazing. It was a huge learning experience for me as well. So I didn't take any of it for granted, basically.
Yeah. Well, you've done a really remarkable job, and
Thank you.
hopefully we'll get more episodes out of all of this once everybody
Hope
gets a
so.
chance to see it. Thank you so much for such a great conversation.
No, thank you. It's been great.